Hello, everybody. My name is Nathalie Gontier. I work at the Applied Evolutionary Epistemology Lab of the Center for Philosophy of Science at the Faculty of Science of the University of Lisbon in Portugal. And I'm going to be talking about science as a public good, lessons from mutual aid and symbiology. And I want to thank the organizers very kindly for inviting me to open this symposium on history and philosophy of science in the Russian tradition. I would have very much liked to be present in St. Petersburg in beautiful Russia to have this talk amongst all of you. But unfortunately, it was not meant to be. And I hope that maybe in the future we will be able to meet in person. I'm also very honored to be the person that has this opening because I am not Russian. So I apologize for speaking in English. So the general theme of the conference is science as a public good. And that, of course, made me think about the very famous book written in 1985 by Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, The Dialectical Biologist. And in that book, in chapter 8, which they call the commoditization of science, they open the chapter by saying modern science is a product of capitalism. That, of course, is a very strong statement to say that science is actually a product of capitalism, a product of a certain type of economic system, of a certain type of political system. And so they go on to say that the economic foundation of modern science is the need for capitalists not only to expand horizontally into new regions, but to transform production, create new products, make production methods more profitable, and to do all this ahead of others who are doing the same. Its ideological underpinnings are congruent with these needs and also with the political philosophy of the bourgeois revolution. Individualism belief in a marketplace of ideas, internationalism, nationalism, and rejection of authority as the basis of knowledge. And so basically what they are saying in that entire chapter is that any kind of scientific project or discoveries or the patenting of discoveries, scientific reports, academic positions, and knowledge are becoming commodities. And they are becoming a public good. Science is something that is driven by politics and that is being used by politics and that in turn also underlies politics. Now, this is, of course, a very strong statement. Is there something like value-free science? Is that possible? Or is science always used for the good of something else, in a Machiavellian way even? And if it is indeed true that science and politics go hand in hand, then we can immediately throw back that argument to the authors and ask ourselves the question, what was the political motivation, the science political motivation for these scholars to publish the book The Dialectical Biologist? What kind of a political message did they want to introduce there, and how also did they see politics in general, political systems in general, associate with their science? And so here we can say two things. One of them is that these scholars self-identified as Marxists, and they also dedicate their work to Engels. So they make that very clear that they have that political affinity with that school. But then they go on and they say, well, if we look at that, how can that somehow be introduced into evolutionary biology? What would be the benefit of introducing this kind of thinking into evolutionary biology? And there they link that to the debate that goes on between reductionism and holism. And so they want to introduce that into evolutionary biology, and that is what they call the dialectics of biology. Now, the dialectics of biology is a discussion on hierarchy theory, and hierarchy theory is a discussion of how parts divide into wholes. This is a very ancient question. Aristotle already asked the question of how parts associate and bring forth larger wholes, and how wholes divide into functional parts. And so people have been debating that for a very long time, and there exist basically two schools, reductionist schools and holistic schools. Reductionist schools say that if you look at hierarchies, the bottom levels of the hierarchy bring forth the higher levels of the hierarchy. So if you introduce that into evolutionary biology, What you say is that genes bring forth organisms and organisms bring forth species. So that is something that is known as a form of upward causation. And it is a form of reductionism because basically you can explain higher levels through the workings, the mechanistic workings of the lower levels. So genes somehow are assumed to bring forth organisms, and then organisms group into species. That is the foundation of the modern synthesis. It is also the foundation of molecular genetics. Now, with the evolution of science, people have asked whether the opposite can also be true, whether species somehow are able to influence organisms. First of all, whether species are some kind of individual or some kind of entity that has a causal influence, a causal impact on organisms, and whether organisms have a causal impact on how genes evolve. And this is a question that is being raised within current Eco-Evo-Devo schools and within the extended synthesis. But the debate goes back much further in time, and one of the first people to talk about this opposite direction of causality was Donald Campbell, who was a psychologist, and he introduced the term downward causation, where he investigated how social groups, cultural groups, languages can influence, for example, the brain of an individual. And so this is something that associates with that. And so what Lewontin and Levins wanted to do with their book is introduce this discussion of reductionism and holism, and they wanted to defend the position that it is possible to accept processes such as downward causation or holistic approaches in evolutionary biology. And as such, they opposed themselves to the founders of the modern synthesis, and especially the reductionism that was introduced after the foundation of the modern synthesis, that associates with the introduction of genetics, where people for some time tried to understand human behavior or any kind of organismal behavior by trying to reduce it to the working of the genes. And so they said, no, we need to look into how organisms function, how they have some kind of autonomy, how they have an ecology, how they interact with other organisms, and how that in turn feeds back into the gene pool. So here's a question. Are all scholars who recognize the existence of downward causation Marxists? Because that eventually is what Levins and Lewontin appear to be implying, that there is an association with holistic thinking and with ideas on downward causation and ideas on Marxism. And that then brings us to the following question. Does holistic thinking in evolutionary biology associate with social political thought? And if it does, what kind of social political thought? Is it a form of communist thought? And if it associates with some kind of communism, then does that bring us to Russia, which is the east of Europe? Because we can also not forget that Marx and Engels were Western Europeans. So if that somehow associates with that kind of thinking, then where do we find the origin, and what is the role of communism and of Russia and of Western Europe and also of the Anglo-Saxons in bringing forth that idea? And so that is what we are going to talk about today, what I would like to discuss with you today, the question whether or not there is such a thing as a value-free science. And so we're going to look into the origin of biological evolutionary theories and how they associate with the origin of certain sociopolitical schools of thought. So we're going to look into how moral philosophy basically drives scientific thinking within evolutionary biology. So the question is, the socialism and liberalism, the debate between socialists and liberalists, somehow feed into debates on cooperation versus competition in evolutionary biology, and we are going to look into that discussion by looking into the origins of Darwinism and also symbiology, because especially symbiosis research has a very strong Russian tradition of scholars who were invested into the study of symbiosis and symbiogenesis, with scholars such as Konstantin Merezkovsky and Fominstein and Kozopolyansky. So is nature red in tooth and claw, or is it social? These are questions that were first raised on a secular level by moral philosophers and a group of moral philosophers that we call social contract theoreticians. So examples of that are Thomas Hobbes, Adam Smith, David Hume, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And so what these people did is they investigated the nature of human nature. So according to Hobbes, for example, the natural state of humankind was one where people are at war amongst themselves. So there was no possibility of cooperation, and there had to be a strong leader, a leviathan, that was able to reign over the people and that was able to bring forth a commonwealth. People such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and also David Hume, on the other hand, thought that humans were good-natured and that they had an ability to cooperate together and to form natural bonds and social bonds that could underlie the formation of a welfare state. So it is in these debates on human nature and on the nature of society that people start to develop developmental laws, and that they introduce political systems. And so discussions arise on what are public goods, what is the nature of natural resources, how can they be distributed justly amongst nations, is there a division of labor that can be natural, and how can we bond individuals into a society where they give up part of their individual freedom and bring forth a society. So liberal ideas are ideas that especially develop in Anglo-Saxon traditions, and Darwin was very much inspired by those ideas, and so it is general knowledge that he was influenced by Adam Smith's liberal idea of a free market economy and his metaphor of the invisible hand. Now, Adam Smith developed this metaphor to describe economical systems, but Darwin in many ways understood natural selection as an invisible hand in nature. Thomas Malthus, he was also inspired by Thomas Malthus, who introduced the idea of there being a scarcity of resources and a struggle for existence. From Herbert Spencer and Thomas Huxley, he got the idea that there is such a thing as sociocultural progress. From Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he took the notion of adaptation, and adaptation implies a form of progress, a form of teleology. And he was also inspired by Francis Bacon's induction theory and by Charles Lyell's uniformitarianism and by William von Humboldt and August Schleicher's ideas on language change. And it is especially August Schleicher, for example, that introduces, together with other scholars, three metaphors of language evolution. And Darwin would also make use of a tree metaphor to describe the evolution of living organisms. And what about socialism? Many scholars associate socialist thinking with symbiology research, and sometimes they also use it as a way to attack scholars that are researching symbiology, saying that it is a socialist idea. And here, let's look into whether or not that is justified. So symbiology refers to research on symbiosis and symbiogenesis. And symbiosis is mainly an ecological phenomenon that has an impact on evolution. And symbiogenesis is an evolutionary mechanism that occurs through hereditary symbiosis. And so symbiosis is an ecological phenomenon that refers to the living together of unlike named organisms. It was defined as such by Anton de Bary, who was a German scholar and who studied lichens. And lichens were investigated earlier in time and described already earlier in time by Simon Schwendener, who was a Swiss. And so he was the first to demonstrate that lichens are composite organisms. So what are lichens? Lichens are fungi that in their filaments house algae or cyanobacteria, or sometimes both. And so because of that, the fungi becomes a new individual, a lichens, and these lichens as a composite organism demonstrates properties that it cannot demonstrate on its own, and these properties can also be very beneficial. for both of the entities that entertain the symbiotic association. And in that regard, symbiosis can take on many forms. It can be both beneficial or detrimental to the organisms that engage into a symbiotic association. And so here it was Pierre-Joseph van Beneden, who was a Belgian researcher that studied under Cuvier in France, that distinguished between different types of symbiotic associations, and he distinguished between commensalism, parasitism, and mutualism. And Van Beneden, for example, said that when taking a closer look at the animal world, it does not take long to find more than one analogy with human society. If I'm allowed to say so, there is not one social position found in human society that is not also found in the animal kingdom. Most of the animals live peacefully from the fruits of their labors and exercise a profession that gives them life. But at the sidelines of these honest industrials, we also find miserable ones who cannot do without the assistance of their neighbors, some of whom establish themselves as parasites in their organs, others as commensals, commensaux, that take profit from the gains, the labors of the honest. And so here you see that the terminology used to describe these symbiotic associations as they occur in the organic world among biological organisms is a terminology that derives directly from human society and from human social relationships. And so that is something very interesting, because here you see that the way human society is structured and the behavior that humans portray is something that feeds into how biologists understand biological relationships amongst organisms that are not human. And symbiosis research then indeed has this history of trying to find links between human societies, the political structures of human societies, and animal societies. Also the idea that there is such a thing as animal societies, or that we can find the division of labor inside of the animal kingdom, is an idea that associates with symbiosis research. And there is then the link between the symbiosis research and ideas on political thinking. And we find that in all scholars who introduce symbiosis research, and so from Van Beneden, Schwendener, and Anton de Barry onwards, other scholars that get involved in symbiosis research are Van Minsin, Bernard Frank, Kropotkin, Wilhelm Schimper, and Paul Buchner. And what we see there then is that this tradition is mostly a Germanic tradition. Also, the Russians involved in symbiosis research will mainly write in German. Kropotkin, for example, wrote in English, and there is also a bit of a French tradition, but most of the work done on symbiosis associates with Lichen research, and Lichen research has a very strong German tradition. And also Kropotkin is part of this tradition when he introduces his ideas on mutual aid and on mutualism. And what we see is that he writes in English with the explicit goal to counter Darwinian thinking. And so in his book on mutual aid, he says in his introduction, two aspects of animal life impressed me most during journeys which I made in my youth in eastern Siberia and northern Manchuria. One of them was the extreme severity of the struggle for existence, which most species of animals have to carry on against an inclement nature, the enormous destruction of life, which periodically results from natural agencies, and the consequent paucity of life over the vast territory which fell under my observation. The other was that even in those few spots where animal life teemed in abundance, I failed to find, although I was eagerly looking for it, that bitter struggle for the means of existence amongst animals belonging to the same species, which was considered by most Darwinists, though not always by Darwin himself, as the dominant characteristic of struggle for life and the main factor of evolution. But it is important to note that Kropotkin there is directly inspired by Karl Fedorovich Kessler, and Karl Fedorovich Kessler was the dean of St. Petersburg University But he also had German roots. So there is really this connection between German thinking and Russian thinking. And that is something that I think that is not explored enough within current historical research on symbiosis and symbiogenesis. And there, if there are Russian scholars that would be interested on working on that, I would also be very interested in collaborating there. But so who was this Karl Fedorovich Kessler? When in 1880 he gave a talk, a lecture for the Russian Congress of Naturalists, and there he was the one that first introduced the notion of the law of a mutual aid. And so he said that if you look at nature, you basically see two phenomena that are universal. One is based on nutrition and the other is based on reproduction. And this nutrition, he says, leads indeed to a form of competition, and there you can have some kind of Darwinian struggle for existence, and perhaps even a Spencerian survival of the fittest. But on the other hand, he said, if you look into the animal kingdom, what you have there is reproduction. And reproduction, he says, leads to a form of cooperation. Why? Because it is through reproduction that you see the evolution of parental care. And parental care, he says, leads to the origin of the family. And there, of course, the concept of the family at that time was already a very political concept. And many people, for example, in sociology and in political science, understand the family as the first institution, the first sociological institution that founds society, that brings forth societal and social living. And so this Karl Fedorovich Kessler brings that out, and he says it is with the evolution of parental care that we can have the evolution of a kind of mutual aid and of society. And so Kropotkin further develops that idea when he talks about mutual aid, and he understands mutual aid as a law of nature that complements natural selection or mutual struggle. And he thereby opposes himself to these Darwinian ideas of competition, but it is important to note that he also opposes himself towards romantic ideas that associate with Rousseau, for example, in France, and that we also find to a certain extent that romanticism in the works of Van Beneden, when he talks about this chain of being and this harmonious way of being in the world. And it is also something that Kropotkin dissociates himself in. There is no romantic idea associated with his emphasis on mutual aid. He understands that as a part of the way the organic world is organized, but there is no romantic association with it. In fact, he tries to associate that with a form of anarchistic communism. So now let's turn to symbiogenesis. Symbiogenesis, as I said, is an evolutionary mechanism. And so it is an evolutionary mechanism that occurs through hereditary symbiosis. So that means that symbiosis, the living together of different organisms, becomes permanent and it becomes hereditary. So it becomes transmitted across generations through time. So we know that symbiogenesis has played a very important role in the origin of certain cell bodies that we find inside of the eukaryotic cell. So examples are mitochondria, which we see here in the orange, and another example are chloroplasts, which we see here in green. Chloroplasts are found in the cell bodies of plants, and mitochondria are found in the cell bodies of plants and also of animals and certain protists. So we know that these mitochondria, the orange line that we see in this image, evolved from aeroproteobacteria, and we know that the chloroplasts that we find in plants evolved from photosynthetic bacteria, more specifically cyanobacteria. So when we look into these cell bodies, these organelles, we find their genetic material, and when researchers investigate that genetic material, they still see that that genetic material is very similar to the free living bacteria from which they evolved. So symbiogenesis was first formulated by the Russian scholar Konstantin Merezkovsky, and he wrote down his scientific theories in German and in French journals. And so according to Merezkovsky, life knows a double origin. He introduced the kingdom of Monera, and he said that that kingdom resulted from the combination, the symbiogenetic combination of two protoplasmas, so two lineages, and they together underwent a first symbiosis, and then that life in a second symbiosis acquired cyanobacteria. And so in his 1905 work, and this is my translation, he wrote, all assumed and still assume today that one plasma underlies all organisms. In other words, that out of non-being, life came forth from one root, from where one tree of organisms developed, first as a common trunk of protists, and then the tree split into two main axes, the plant axis and the animal axis. Until now, there was the general conviction that the tree of life was a single one. The task set forth in this work is to demonstrate that there are two trees of life, and that each tree originated on its own and independently from the other one, and this probably happened in different periods of Earth's history. These trees partly developed on their own and independently from one another, and partly stringed together and closely grew and developed together. Both trees are responsible for the diversity of organic beings. The idea of a unity of organic nature has to be abandoned in favor of the idea of nature's duality. So here, and this is very early on in time, in 1905, the tree of life is already under attack, and it is under attack because of symbiogenesis. And this scientific debate basically only took flight around the 1990s. So it took quite some time before it was recognized indeed that there are these symbiogenetic events occurring in nature, and that this disables us to understand the evolution of life from within a tree metaphor or a tree diagram. Now, it has to be said that Konstantin Merezkovsky was a rather controversial figure. There was an article written on that by Ansab Francisco Carapiso and Mikhail Zolotonosov, who wrote about the accusations that there were about Konstantin Merezkovsky being a pedophile. And he was also politically engaged insofar as that he wrote two very strange books, one in Russian and one in French, on a new utopian society and how that, according to him, had to be, wherein he talks about, or wherein he defends the idea of pedophilia and also of genocide and other bad things. So he was a very controversial figure. But what strikes me, but I don't know, I have not read the Russian work, yet, but what strikes me is that there was apparently no intervention there of his scientific ideas into these political ideas, but I can be wrong there. And less controversial figures that lay at the foundation of symbiogenesis theory were Andreas Schimper, Andrei Faminsin, and Kozo Polyansky. And Schimper thereby wrote a very rudimentary theory on the bacterial origin of chloroplasts, but it was especially Faminsin, who also has roots in St. Petersburg, that emphasized the important role of symbiogenesis, and that also pointed at chloroplasts as being of a bacterial origin. And then Boris Kozopolyansky, he also tried to integrate symbiogenesis theory already with Darwinian evolutionary theories. But so what happened here is that these scholars basically define their theories on symbiogenesis independently from one another. And in fact, symbiogenesis has been discovered and rediscovered several times over by different scholars. And so the most important scholars that have been engaged in the study of symbiogenesis have been Faminsin, Konstantin Merezkovsky, Andreas Wilhelm Schimper, Paul Potier, Ivan Emmanuel Wallin, Paul Büchner, Boris Kozopolyansky, Joshua Lederberg, and then Lynn Margulis, who is the founding mother of the current theory of symbiogenesis, the theory of symbiogenesis as we know it today. So here again, two questions. Are these scholars all socialists? That's the first question. And I must say that I do not know the political preference of several of these scholars. What I do know is that Margulis, for example, was very outspoken against the Darwinian paradigm because she said that their emphasis on competition was exaggerated. Now, that in and of itself does not make a person immediately also a socialist. People that study genetic drift and ecological drift, for example, also say that there is not necessarily the scarcity of resources in nature, that it is not empirically grounded. On the other hand, a second question, and the question that I like to raise now is, what is the science political message of symbiology? If there is such a thing as a politics of science, then what is the science political message of symbiology? Well, symbiosis and symbiogenesis today form part of a larger and a growing theoretical framework that investigates reticulate evolution. And so reticulate evolution or network-like evolution is evolution that researches the crossings of evolutionary lineages. So a tree of life, the diagram of a tree of life demonstrates how existing lineages branch and diversify into other lineages. So you have a ramification in the tree of life. What happens in the study of reticulate evolution is that scholars investigate how lineages can cross, and lineages can cross through symbiosis or symbiogenesis, but they can also cross because of hybridization or because of lateral gene transfer, or what Lederberg called infective heredity. And so what is on the agenda, on the political agenda here, is how evolution is depicted. Is it depicted in a tree of life, or should we instead think in terms of a network of life? That is one of the things that is on the scientific agenda, and that is part of the politics, of the political debates that are being held between scholars that study symbiology and that work from within a Darwinian framework. A second one then, of course, is also the question of competition versus cooperation. Now, another item that is on the science political agenda of people that study reticulate evolution is the question of how do we understand hierarchies, evolutionary hierarchies, when we recognize the importance of reticulate evolution. So I began my presentation by saying that there are different ways in which evolutionary biologists understand causation, and this is something that happens from within hierarchy theory. So the founders of the modern synthesis and also the founders of molecular genetics assume the form of upward causation. That means that the lower level of a hierarchy, genes for example, are assumed to bring forth the focal level and the upper level of a hierarchy. So genes for example are assumed to bring forth organisms, and organisms are assumed to bring forth species. This is a form of upward causation that associates with reductionist thinking, because the idea is that causality can be reduced to the lowest level of a hierarchy. With the association of theorizing, with the introduction of theorizing on the nature of the extended evolutionary synthesis and what that might be, people investigate the opposite, and they investigate whether there is such a thing as downward causation. So whether the upper level can bring forth the focal level, and whether the focal level can bring forth the lower level or influence the lower level. And this is a question, for example, raised in Evo schools, where people investigate how organisms can possibly influence how genes will evolve through, for example, epigenetic processes. Now, when we look into the nature of reticulate evolution, so evolution as it occurs by symbiosis, symbiogenesis, but also hybridization or lateral gene transfer, these classic hierarchies are no longer sufficient to think about causal processes as they occur through reticulate evolution. So what happens there, for example, with lateral gene transfer, what happens is that people study how genes of one organism are able to penetrate the genome of another organism, belonging perhaps even to another domain of life. So during infections, for example, bacterial infections or viral infections, what happens is that a virus is able to penetrate our cells and to donate his genes to the genes of the cell that it penetrates. Also, during hybridization, what happens is that organisms from different species produce viable offspring that contains half of the genes of each parent. And also during symbiosis and symbiogenesis, what happens is that organisms belonging to different species, sometimes different kingdoms and even different domains of life, work together to produce a holobiont. So what we see here then is that the question is raised how not only a lower level influences an upper level and how it can perhaps even skip a couple of strands within a hierarchy. The question also becomes how different levels of a hierarchy work together reticulately, so in a network-like fashion. And so we need to have a new concept of causation, and that concept I call a form of reticulate causation. So reticulate evolutionary mechanisms necessitate us to recognize the existence of reticulate causal processes that not only occur upward a hierarchy or downward a hierarchy, but that involve numerous horizontal and network-like interactions between the elements of different hierarchies. And then on a meta level also there, the question is, does that itself also somehow associate with a political statement? And I think that there also it does. One of the things that this implies is the acceptance and the recognition of plurality. And of course, the political equivalent of recognizing plurality is multiculturalism. And this is the current human condition. Nobody today lives isolated anymore. There is this multicultural society, and that too, thinking about multiculturalism is a form of thinking about reticulation and about causality, in thinking about causality in reticulate terms. And then on yet another meta level, we can also say that science itself is a symbiont. So we find these processes of reticulation also in how science develops. Because here, for example, reticulate causation, the ideas defended there are a combination of ideas defended by the founders of the modern synthesis and by people who adhere to an extended evolutionary synthesis and by people that study reticulate evolution. And so as such, science itself and also evolutionary biology itself is something that is a symbiont, a chimera of different evolutionary ideas. And so I would refer to my two papers on universalizing symbiogenesis in that regard. So in conclusion, we can say that politics indeed feeds into evolutionary thinking, and in the history of science, it has done so several times over. But it is not only political thinking that defines evolutionary thinking, it is basically a human life, human existence that helps to define science. In fact, doing science is a cognitive skill that is performed by the group, and one can also say that science in many ways is itself a culture. And so we can say that the sociocultural life underlies the perspective of science, and that science in many ways is anthropomorphic, but we are also stuck with ourselves. We are developing a human science. And on the other hand, evolutionary thinking also feeds into politics. That, of course, does not imply that every Darwinian is a liberal and that every symbiologist is a socialist. But of course, we need to be conscious and we need to be reflexive about it. And it is also something that can be studied from within the history and philosophy of science. And so this is the end of my presentation, and I want to take the opportunity to thank, and very kindly so, Lada and Elena and the other organizers for this amazing event. I know that it must have been very difficult to organize this during COVID times, and I want to congratulate you very much and thank you very kindly for having had me as a speaker.